Killing Machine, or Hellbent for Leather, depends on how you know it, is probably the most significant album in the entire Judas Priest discography.
That's nothing new.
Released on the 9th of October 1978, Killing Machine became the 5th studio album by the legendary UK heavy metal band Judas Priest. And so, just as we do with every Judas Priest album on the Defenders of the Faith series, let's take a look at some of the lesser known facts about the album and hopefully answer the question of why is it so significant for Judas Priest's career and for heavy metal overall. Here you go. By the way, please do not hesitate to comment on anything you hear or see in this video, and especially if you disagree with me, because the whole point of the Defenders of the Faith series is of course to start a conversation. But alright, let's do it. By 1978, Judas Priest were steady on their way to dominate the world of heavy music, with Black Sabbath somewhat taking a back seat for a while, and new wave of British heavy metal not entirely forming its shape yet. And so CBS Records were rather insistent on Judas Priest staying on radar and having as much exposure as possible, and thus going straight back to the studio right after the extensive tour in support of Stay in Class, which actually resulted in Killing Machine being the only Judas Priest album in the entire discography which was released the same year as the previous record. Yet there was a reason why metal wasn't getting as much attention as deserved by the late 70s, and that of course being that the eyes of the world were too busy concentrating on the punk rock movement instead. Thus what Judas Priest did on Killing Machine became somewhat of a pivotal point, and not really only for the band, but rather for entire heavy metal as a genre. You see, while being the pioneers of heavy metal, Judas Priest, of course, were influenced by anything surrounding them, including punk rock. And so, on their 5th record, Judas Priest, maybe unconsciously, simplified their songwriting style, moving away from the gothic ambiance of the early 70s towards realism and a more commercial sound and lyrics, which became somewhat of a standard for pretty much all the metal bands in the 80s, and is perfectly exemplified in such tracks as Hellbent for Leather and Running Wild. Oh, wait. By the way, fun fact, Killing Machine is actually the very first album on which Glenn Tipton adopted the tap-and-playing technique, which was popularized by Eddie Van Halen earlier that year. Yet punk rock's simple song structure and down-to-earth lyrics weren't really the only thing which caught the eye of the media. Their rebellious image did, compared to whom metal bands of that time looked like a bunch of hippies.
Judas Priest! Thank you very much.
And so when Judas Priest introduced their new style on Killing Machine full of leather and studs, this immediately caught attention of mainstream media, which never happened for them before. This style has of course been quickly adopted by pretty much all new wave of British heavy metal bands, and since then considered to be pretty much a standard for a metalhead's look. I actually do not intend to go into the details of the fashion and how it evolved, especially since it wasn't really finalized up until 1980 and the release of British Steel, with one founding member proudly holding the fort and wearing his white satin shirt. Yet I'll be more than happy to make a special episode on the evolution of heavy metal fashion, so if you think that such episode would be of interest for you, please let me know in the comments.
Write that down, write that down!
All of the buzz in the media of course resulted in enormous success of the album in the United Kingdom, with Killing Machine becoming the very first album on which Judas Priest proudly recorded the first lip-sync videos. Evening Star, Rock Forever and Killing Machine, each one of those got itself one lip-sync promotional video, and Take on the World, which was released as one of the singles prior to the album and topped at number 14 in UK charts, got itself 2 of those, one of which was recorded at Top of the Pops.
We're gonna drive you, we're gonna ride you, we're gonna get right inside you.
By the way, it is this performance at Top of the Pops at which Rob Halford famously got into a fight with Mary Osmond about him not being able to use his whip on stage because they thought it was immoral, and then when he finally won the fight and was allowed to do that, forgot to crack the whip during the performance.
And together we will take on all the world.
Yet Rob, of course, was not forgetting to use his bullwhip on stage, fake whipping the fans in the first row and firing machine gun at them during the genocide song. It eventually became an essential part of a Judas Priest show, and while this act has of course been criticized by many, CBS Records didn't forget to seize an opportunity and released a bunch of t-shirts and exclusive pins which said "I've been whipped by Rob Halford." Those t-shirts are of course virtually impossible to find right now, yet what you can get is a Metal Pilgrim t-shirt, which firstly will of course support the show, and secondly definitely catch the eye of Rob Halford at the next Judas Priest concert. I think we all know why by now.
Hello, Metal Pilgrims.
And of course, in addition to having a new look, it is on the tour in support of this album on which Rob Halford rode a motorcycle on stage for the very first time. When going to the venue before one of the shows on tour, Rob Halford and the rest of the band saw a motorcycle parked in front of it.
Here's an opportunity to be creative.
And so Rob had a crazy idea, and after waiting for the motorcycle's owner, who happened of course to be a Judas Priest fan, he actually asked the guy if he can borrow his motorcycle and ride it on stage during the show tonight. And we all know what happened after. Everyone in the crowd absolutely loved it. The band actually continued doing that on the United Kingdom tour, and when they first got in the United States after that, Harley Davidson actually agreed to sell them their first Fat Boy for only $1.
They were going into a bit of a slump at the time, and I think they figured the Priest could give them a bit of publicity and so forth.
And while finally hitting the singles charts in their home country was of course a big deal for Judas Priest, we all know that pretty much all bands of the late 70s dreamt of making it in the United States. And since the label actually thought that Killing Machine might be the breakthrough record for Judas Priest, they gave a lot of attention of how and what they promote over across the pond. Columbia Records actually decided that they do not like the violent title Killing Machine for the American market, since it could have had some murderous implications, especially after a series of mass shootings in the late 70s in the US. In addition to that, department store Kmart was a big opponent of the title, and several national radio stations actually threatened to not take any singles in rotation if they decide to go with the title.
What?
And while Killing Machine didn't really have anything to do with murder and actually referred to the band themselves and their music, the label and the band settled on the song Hellbent for Leather as a title track for the US market. By the way, if you ever wondered, this song's title was actually taken from the 1958 song Rawhide by Frank Lane. Okay, and I'll be honest here, despite me knowing this album as Killing Machine when I was growing up, I actually think that the title Hellbent for Leather suits it much more, especially since the US version also had Green Militia in it. Killing Machine's album artwork was designed once again by Roslav Zaibo, whom I think all of the channel viewers should know pretty well by now. And for me personally, it actually perfectly captures the entire essence and feel of this album. The cover, of course, features a mannequin head with a studded leather biker headgear and a bloodstained shattered goggles. All in all, it should have produced this cold look of a killing machine and emphasized the new look of the band. In addition, this cover was simply perfect for when the band decided to switch the name for a US mark, because it fitted with both Killing Machine and Hellbent for Leather just as well. One important note is that on this record, Roslav Zaibo actually slightly modified the logo which he created for the previous album, Stained Class, and added another little point under the underline under the word Judas and shortened the bridge between Judas and Priest. And this eventually would become the final version of the logo the band would use up until today. The only question I personally have about this artwork is, what kind of shades does this mannequin have and where can I get them? I think you will agree that it wouldn't really be a 70s Judas Priest album episode if we wouldn't feature our drummers and dramas a bit. Of course, it was the last studio album to feature Les Binks on drums.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Les Binks, and I'll now pass you on to...
Binks, of course, stayed with the band till 1979 and was featured on Unleashed in the East, one of the greatest live albums of all times, yet left the band shortly before its release. And according to Rob Halford, the band back then actually didn't know why Les Binks left Judas Priest.
Just like that. It just went up.
It just was like a flash of green light, and that was it.
And it was not until several years later when, in a private conversation with KK Downing, Les Binks actually said that the management didn't pay him for Unleashed in the East.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Well, I guess at this point we will never actually know the truth, yet one thing is absolutely apparent. Judas Priest's hunt for a permanent drummer has continued. Killing Machine's significance lies in it being the album of first. It is the first album on which Glenn Tipton adopted the nude playing technique. It is the first album on which Judas Priest finally got into the UK singles charts. It is the first album on which Judas Priest, and actually heavy metal itself, finally got itself a style, and the first time a motorcycle has been ridden on a Judas Priest show. And most importantly, it is the very first time when Judas Priest finally gone mainstream and shouted to the entire world that metal is not just some kind of underground movement which will disappear in a year or two, but it is here to stay.
Exactly.
On Killing Machine, Judas Priest broke away from the standard Black Sabbath and themselves established earlier in the decade, and still made it work and sound like Judas Priest. It showed the band that experiments can actually bring you enormous financial success, and they will actually continue these experiments throughout their career. I actually believe that, despite every Judas Priest album having this trademark sound, they do not actually sound alike at all. And while Judas Priest themselves will deviate from the style of this record later on in the 80s, it is Killing Machine that will be cited as one of the most influential albums for most of the new wave of British heavy metal bands in the early 80s. But again, that's just my opinion. Please let us know what you guys think about Killing Machine, or Hellbent for Leather, depends on how you know it. And of course, let us know which is your personal favorite song from this record. As always, thank you so much for watching, guys, and keep rocking.